On a gray Tuesday morning in late October, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus Webb stood on the corner of Fairmont and 6th, watching a line of black SUVs roll slowly toward the curb outside the old Pembroke Hotel. He had seen plenty of fancy cars pass through this part of town before, but never four at once, and never moving with the kind of careful, deliberate silence that made the whole street feel like it was holding its breath. The lead vehicle began to ease into a parking spot directly beneath a sagging steel scaffold that had been groaning in the wind for 3 days. Marcus had walked past that scaffold every morning on his way to school, and every morning it had sounded a little worse, a little closer to giving way. He did not know who was inside that car. He only knew that if it parked there, someone was going to get hurt. So he ran. He ran into the street with his backpack still slung over one shoulder, waving both arms over his head, screaming the only words that came to him. Don't park. Keep driving. Please, don't park there. What happened in the next 90 seconds would end up on the front page of 3 newspapers. But in that exact moment, Marcus Webb had no idea that the man stepping out of the back seat of that SUV was about to become the most important person of his entire life. He only knew that the scaffold was creaking, that the wind was picking up, and that somebody had to do something before it was too late. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The driver of the lead SUV slammed the brakes so hard that the second car nearly rear-ended it. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped halfway out of the back door, one polished shoe still on the running board. His face caught somewhere between irritation and confusion. His name was Richard Calloway, and very few people in that city would have recognized him on sight, because Richard Calloway had spent the last 15 years deliberately staying out of photographs. He was the founder of a logistics and infrastructure company worth more than $11 billion, a man whose decisions moved freight, jobs, and city budgets, but whose face had never once appeared on a magazine cover. He looked at the boy standing in the middle of the street, breathless, pointing upward at the scaffold, and for half a second he almost ordered his driver to keep moving. Billionaires do not usually stop for children shouting in traffic. But something in the boy's voice, some specific, terrified certainty, made Richard Calloway pause with his hand still on the door. And in that pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4, the wind gusted hard down Fairmont Street, and the scaffold above the exact spot where his car had been about to park let out a metallic groan that everyone on that block would remember for the rest of their lives. The second SUV had already begun to creep forward into the space behind the first, and the driver, watching his boss frozen halfway out of the car, did not know whether to brake or keep moving. For a moment, the entire convoy simply sat there, idling, while pedestrians on the opposite sidewalk slowed their pace to watch. An older woman walking a small dog stopped entirely and put a hand over her mouth. A delivery driver leaned out of his truck window to get a better look. Marcus kept his arm raised, pointing at the scaffold joint nearest the building's third-floor ledge, the one his father had once taught him to call the failure point, the place where a structure under stress always breaks first. He did not know the man's name. He did not know what the cars cost or who they belonged to. He only knew the sound, and the sound was getting worse. Nobody standing on Fairmont Street that morning understood the full shape of what was happening. The construction crew responsible for the scaffold had walked off 2 days earlier in a dispute over unpaid wages, leaving the structure half-secured and entirely unmonitored. The city inspector who was supposed to flag it for emergency reinforcement had a stack of 40 other open cases on his desk and had not yet made it to this block. And the man whose car Marcus Webb had just stopped from parking beneath that scaffold had absolutely no idea that his own company, 3 subsidiaries and 2 acquisitions removed from his daily oversight, had a controlling stake in the very construction firm that abandoned the job. Richard Calloway did not know that yet. Marcus Webb did not know that yet. Nobody on that street knew it. What they knew was simpler and more immediate. A boy had just possibly saved a stranger's life, and that stranger wanted to know why. 3 questions hung in the air over Fairmont Street that morning, questions that would take weeks to fully answer. Why did this particular 12-year-old understand structural danger well enough to read a failing scaffold from half a block away? What was Richard Calloway really doing in this neighborhood, a part of the city his itinerary said he had no business visiting. And why? When his assistant later pulled the company records on that property, did one name keep surfacing that Calloway had not seen in 17 years, a name connected to the worst decision of his professional life. Calloway's itinerary that morning had listed a single line item: site visit, Fairmont Corridor redevelopment. His assistant had scheduled it 3 weeks earlier as a routine stop, one of 40 similar visits he made every year to properties his company either owned outright or held through a tangle of subsidiaries most employees couldn't have named if asked. He had not chosen this particular block. A junior analyst had simply slotted it into his calendar between two more important meetings, and Calloway, true to his habits, had not looked closely enough at the address to recognize what it actually was. He would only learn later, sitting at his kitchen table at 1 a.m. with a folder of old personnel files spread in front of him, that the Fairmont Corridor project had once, years earlier, fallen under the same regional division that had employed a foreman named Andre Webb. To understand why Marcus Webb knew what he knew, you would have to go back 6 years, to a smaller apartment on Bellwether Avenue, where a man named Andre Webb used to come home every evening with steel dust on his boots and a rolled-up set of blueprints under his arm. Andre had been a structural foreman for 19 years, the kind of man who could look at a beam and tell you, almost by instinct, whether it would hold. He had started as an apprentice at 19 years old himself, sweeping scrap metal off job sites for men twice his age who barely acknowledged him. And he had worked his way up through every position on a crew until he was the man other foremen called when they couldn't figure out why a structure was settling wrong. He used to sit Marcus down at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons and teach him, the way some fathers teach their sons how to throw a baseball, how to read load-bearing weight, how to spot rust bloom on a joint, how to listen for the specific groan that metal makes right before it gives way. A building talks to you if you know how to listen, Andre used to say, tapping the edge of a blueprint with a pencil while 6-year-old Marcus sat across from him, chin propped on his hands. Most people just never learn the language. He would draw simple diagrams on the back of old receipts, showing Marcus how weight traveled down through a column, how a single weakened joint could shift the entire burden of a structure onto a beam that was never designed to carry it alone. He taught him the difference between a sound that meant settling, ordinary, and harmless, and a sound that meant something was actively failing. He took him, on 2 memorable occasions, to job sites on quiet Saturday mornings before the crews arrived, walking him slowly around the perimeter of half-built structures, pointing out the things most adults walked past without ever noticing. Marcus loved those afternoons more than almost anything in his childhood. His mother, Renata Webb, worked nights as a charge nurse at St. Agnes Memorial, and those quiet Sunday lessons with his father were some of the only uninterrupted hours the two of them had together during a stretch of years when both parents worked exhausting, overlapping shifts just to keep the apartment on Bellwether Avenue and put Marcus through the better public school 2 districts over. Marcus did not know, at 8 years old, that he was being taught a language that would one day save a man's life on a downtown sidewalk. He just knew he liked the sound of his father's voice explaining things, patient and certain, like the world made sense if you paid close enough attention to it. He kept a small spiral notebook, the kind sold 3 for $1 at the corner store, where he copied down his father's diagrams in his own clumsy handwriting, dating each entry like he was keeping a record of something important. Everything changed on a Thursday in March, 4 years before the morning on Fairmont Street, when a retaining wall collapsed on a job site 2 counties over, a project Andre Webb had flagged as structurally unsound 3 separate times in writing. He had submitted his first warning a full month before the collapse, citing improper drainage behind the wall that he believed would cause hydrostatic pressure to build up faster than the design accounted for. He submitted a second, more urgent warning 2 weeks later, after watching hairline cracks appear along the base in a pattern he recognized from a near-failure he'd seen on a different project a decade earlier. His third warning, submitted 4 days before the collapse, used the word emergency in the subject line. The company that owned the contract buried his warnings in a filing cabinet and pushed the timeline forward anyway, because the client wanted to break ground before the fiscal quarter closed, and a delay would have triggered financial penalties written into the contract. When the wall came down, it killed 2 workers and injured 4 others, And in the investigation that followed, executives several pay grades above Andre Webb quietly rewrote the narrative, suggesting the foreman on site, Andre himself, had signed off on a final inspection he never actually performed. The story was simple, convenient, and devastating. A foreman cut a corner, and people died for it. Reporters ran with it because it was easy to understand. Andre Webb lost his license within 6 weeks. He lost his pension shortly after, stripped under a clause buried in his employment contract that voided benefits in cases of gross professional negligence. He spent the next 2 years fighting a case that drained the family's savings, selling first the car, then most of his tools, then eventually moving the family out of the Bellwether Avenue apartment into something smaller and farther from Marcus's school, a move that meant longer bus rides and fewer Sunday afternoons, because Andre had taken on 2 part-time jobs just to keep up with legal fees while the case crawled through appeals. The case ultimately exonerated him, 2 years and 4 months after the collapse, when an independent engineering review uncovered the drainage failure and confirmed his 3 written warnings had been ignored. But the exoneration arrived quietly. A single paragraph in the back pages of the same papers that had once run his name on the front cover, and by then no contractor in the state would hire a man whose name had been dragged through 3 news cycles, even after the truth came out. Andre Webb spent his final working years driving a delivery route, a job that paid less than a third of what he'd earned as a foreman, telling Marcus, on the rare evenings he wasn't too exhausted to talk, that the truth always mattered even when nobody was listening to it. He died of a heart attack 11 months before Marcus stood on that street corner, a man who had been right about everything and lost everything for it anyway. He died, his cardiologist later told Renata, with the kind of heart strain that sometimes comes from years of stress nobody ever sees from the outside. Marcus carried his father's lessons with him like a private inheritance nobody else could see. He still had the spiral notebook, now held together with tape along the spine, and he still added to it occasionally, copying things he noticed on his walk to school, a rusted fire escape, a sagging gutter, a crack in a sidewalk that ran the wrong direction for ordinary settling. His mother sometimes found him standing very still outside buildings, tilting his head, listening to something she couldn't hear, and she never had the heart to tell him to stop, because she understood exactly what he was doing and whose voice he was still listening for. And on that Tuesday morning in October, when he looked up at a scaffold groaning over a black SUV, he heard, with absolute clarity, the exact sound his father had once taught him to fear. Richard Calloway had built his company from a single delivery truck in 1991 into a logistics empire that touched ports, rail lines, and construction supply chains across 9 states. He had grown up the son of a warehouse manager in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and he had carried 2 things out of that childhood into his adult life: an obsessive attention to operational detail and a deep, almost defensive privacy about his personal affairs. He was not, by nature, a sentimental man. He believed in numbers, in margins, in the cold satisfaction of a balance sheet that worked out exactly as projected. He had been profiled exactly twice in major business publications in 30 years, and both times he had declined every personal question, answering only what touched the business itself. But he had not become wealthy by ignoring his instincts either. And his instinct, standing on Fairmont Street, watching a 12-year-old boy point at a scaffold that had nearly come down on his head, told him that something here mattered more than the 7 meetings stacked on his calendar. He canceled the rest of his morning, a thing his assistant would later describe as having happened perhaps 4 times in the 11 years she had worked for him. He asked his driver to pull the car to the curb a block away, walked back to where Marcus was still standing with his mother's old gray scarf wrapped around his neck, and asked him a single question. "How did you know?" Marcus, still catching his breath, told him about his father, about the Sunday lessons, about the sound metal makes right before it fails. He spoke quickly at first, the way kids do when they're not sure an adult is actually going to listen, and then slower, once he realized the tall man in the expensive coat wasn't interrupting, wasn't checking his phone, wasn't glancing past him toward the cars. Calloway listened the entire way through without interrupting once, which was, according to everyone who had ever worked for him, a genuinely rare occurrence. When Marcus finished, Calloway asked for his father's name. Marcus told him. And Richard Calloway, a man who had not visibly reacted to anything in a business meeting in over a decade, went very quiet. He thanked Marcus, shook his hand the way he might shake the hand of a colleague rather than child, and got back into his car without another word. His assistant later said he stared out the window for the entire ride to his next meeting, a meeting he attended but contributed almost nothing to, answering questions a beat too slowly, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. That night, Calloway had his executive assistant pull every internal file connected to the retaining wall collapse from 4 years earlier. It took her until almost midnight to find it, buried under a corporate restructuring that had changed the subsidiary's name twice since the incident, first absorbed into a regional holding company and then folded again into a different division entirely. The kind of administrative reshuffling that happens in large companies for tax and liability reasons, and that nobody outside the finance department ever bothers to track. But there it was. Andre Webb, foreman, terminated, license revoked, name listed in 3 internal memos as the party responsible for signing off on a final inspection. Calloway cross-referenced the inspection logs against the original site reports, the ones nobody in leadership had bothered to review carefully at the time, because the case had been quietly settled and the story had already calcified into something convenient. What he found, reading until nearly 3 in the morning at his kitchen table, was a digital signature timestamp that placed Andre Webb 40 miles away at a different job site, at the exact hour he supposedly signed off on the inspection that never happened. The site badge logs confirmed it independently, a record nobody had cross-checked 4 years earlier, because nobody had been looking for a reason to doubt the story everyone already believed. Someone else had signed his name. Someone still on the payroll. Richard Calloway sat alone in his kitchen with his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and understood, with a sick, sinking certainty, that his company had destroyed an honest man's life to protect a deadline, and that the son of that man had just saved him from being crushed under a steel scaffold without knowing any of it. He did not sleep that night. He sat with the file until the sky outside his kitchen window turned pale gray, the same color, he would later think, as the coat he'd been wearing on Fairmont Street, and by the time the sun was fully up, he had already drafted by hand on a legal pad the outline of what he intended to do next. The following weeks unfolded like an unraveling thread that Calloway could not stop pulling once he had started. He brought in an outside legal team, deliberately separate from his own corporate counsel, because he no longer trusted that anyone close to the original incident would tell him the truth without a reason to protect themselves. He chose a small independent firm with no prior relationship to his company specifically because they had nothing to lose by finding something inconvenient. The investigators worked quietly, interviewing former employees who had left the company years earlier, cross-checking signature logs, pulling old security badge records that showed exactly who had been on site and who had not. Calloway insisted on reading every report personally, every night, often falling asleep at his desk with a folder still open in front of him. His staff noticed the change in him immediately. The man who once measured success purely in quarterly earnings was now spending his evenings buried in a 4-year-old personnel file, chasing down a story that had nothing to do with his bottom line and everything to do with a debt he had not known he owed. His longtime assistant, a woman named Priya Anand who had worked for him for over a decade, later said it was the first time in all those years she had seen him cancel a board call for something he refused to explain. He told her only that it was personal, a word she had never once heard him use about anything connected to the company. The investigators began by re-interviewing the 3 engineers who had originally signed off on the internal report blaming Andre Webb. 2 of them had since left the company and were initially reluctant to speak at all, worried about exposing themselves to liability for a 4-year-old finding they had never personally verified, only approved based on documents handed to them by senior leadership. The 3rd engineer, still employed, refused outright to discuss the case without legal representation present, a reaction that told Calloway's investigators almost as much as a confession would have. They pulled 3 years of badge access log from the regional office building, cross-referencing timestamps against the digital inspection signature, building a timeline hour by hour of who had been where on the day the supposed inspection occurred. The trail led, eventually to a regional operations director named Walter Hensley, a man who had been under enormous pressure from corporate leadership to keep the retaining wall project on schedule. Hensley had been promoted twice in the years following the collapse, climbing from regional operations director to divisional vice president, a trajectory that struck Calloway, once he understood the full picture, as almost grotesque in its quiet cruelty. Hensley had falsified the final inspection signature himself, forging Andre Webb's name onto a document Webb had never seen, because the actual inspection would have delayed the project by 3 weeks, and Hensley could not afford the schedule slip on his own performance record, not with his annual review and bonus structure tied directly to project timelines. The investigators found the forgery confirmed 3 separate ways. Through a forensic handwriting comparison that flagged inconsistencies a layperson would never have noticed, through the badge log placing Hensley, not Webb, in the building at the exact hour the inspection document was generated, and through an internal email recovered from an old server backup nobody had thought to purge, in which Hensley told a subordinate to just get the Webb sign-off logged so we can break ground Monday. A message sent the night before the supposedly completed inspection. When the wall came down and the investigation began, Hensley let the blame settle onto a dead man's reputation rather than risk his own career, and he'd spent the 4 years since quietly climbing the corporate ladder, 2 promotions deep into a division that now reported, by a strange and bitter coincidence, almost directly to Calloway's office. Reading the final report, Calloway felt something close to nausea. He had shaken Hensley's hand at a leadership retreat 8 months earlier and complimented him on his numbers, never once imagining what those numbers had actually cost. Calloway sat with the completed report for 2 full days before deciding what to do with it. He considered briefly handling the entire matter quietly through internal channels, a severance agreement, a confidential settlement, the kind of resolution his legal team strongly recommended as the lowest risk path forward. He rejected that recommendation almost immediately. He had spent 4 years unknowingly benefiting from a story built on a dead man's stolen reputation, and a quiet settlement, he decided, would only be one more version of the same convenient silence that had let the lie stand in the first place. Calloway did not handle what came next quietly, and he did not handle it the way his legal team advised him to. He called a meeting, not in a courtroom, not in a press conference, but in the small visiting room of St. Agnes Memorial, where Renata Webb was finishing a double shift. He had asked Priya to arrange it carefully, making sure Renata understood only that someone wanted to speak with her about her husband, deliberately leaving out his name, because he did not want her walking into that room already armed against him, already braced for another corporate representative offering empty condolences. He brought the full investigative file with him, every page, every signature comparison, every badge record, and he laid it on the table in front of her without a single word of corporate hedging. Renata recognized him the moment he sat down, not from any photograph, but from the unmistakable quality of expensive stillness that surrounded certain kinds of powerful men, and her first instinct, she later admitted, was simple exhaustion, a bracing for one more disappointment from one more person connected to the company that had ruined her husband's final years. "Your husband didn't sign that inspection," Calloway told her. "Someone forged his name to protect a deadline, and my company let the story stand because it was easier than the truth. I'm not going to apologize to you with a press release. I'm going to fix this in full, and I need you to tell me what that actually looks like because I don't think I get to decide that on my own." Renata Webb, who had spent 4 years quietly grieving a husband whose name had been dragged through mud he never deserved, sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before she began to cry, not from sadness alone, but from something closer to relief, the specific exhaustion of finally being believed. She had told this story to lawyers, to reporters, to a handful of friends who eventually stopped asking how the case was going because it was easier for everyone to let it fade. She had told it to Marcus in careful, age-adjusted pieces over the years, trying to explain to a grieving boy why his father's name still occasionally came up in ugly ways online, in old comment threads that never seemed to fully disappear. To hear it confirmed, fully and without qualification, by the one man with the power to actually do something about it, undid something in her that 4 years of legal proceedings never had. She asked him only one question before agreeing to anything. Does Marcus know any of this yet? Calloway told her he did not, that he had come to her first, deliberately, because he did not think a boy who had just saved a stranger's life should also be the first person handed the full weight of his father's vindication without his mother beside him. The company issued a full public retraction within the week, restoring Andre Webb's professional license posthumously and clearing his name in every state record connected to the case. The retraction ran not as a brief corporate statement, but as a detailed account, written with Renata's input and approval, laying out exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. Walter Hensley was terminated and referred to state regulators for the falsified inspection, a process that would eventually result in criminal charges for fraud and falsification of safety records, charges that carried, under state law, the possibility of real prison time, given that the forgery had directly contributed to 2 deaths. But Calloway understood, sitting across from Renata Webb that afternoon, that an apology and a corrected record were not enough to undo 4 years of damage, and he told her so plainly. What he proposed instead surprised even his own board of directors. Richard Calloway established the Andre Webb Structural Integrity Fund, an independent inspection authority funded permanently by his company but operating with full legal autonomy from it, specifically designed so that no foreman anywhere in his supply chain would ever again be pressured into signing off on unsafe work to protect a deadline. The fund's charter, which Calloway insisted on drafting personally alongside his legal team, included a clause that no employee filing a written safety concern could be terminated, demoted, or otherwise penalized for the delay the concern caused, a protection Andre Webb had never had and that might have saved his career and possibly his life had it existed 4 years earlier. He named Renata Webb as a permanent member of its oversight board, not as a symbolic gesture, but because she insisted on understanding every decision the fund made, and because Calloway had learned, in the space of a few weeks, that he trusted her judgment more than he trusted most of his own executives. Renata, who had spent 19 years married to a man who read buildings the way other people read books, brought a perspective to that board no engineering degree could have replicated, an instinct for exactly how easily a written warning could be buried by someone more interested in a deadline than in the truth. And for Marcus, he did something quieter, something that never made it into any press release at all. He set up a private trust to cover the boy's education in full, from that year forward through any university he chose, and he made a standing arrangement to visit the Webb family every few months, not as a billionaire performing generosity for an audience, but as a man who had genuinely come to care what happened to a boy who had once, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, refused to let a stranger walk into danger. He never asked for credit. He specifically requested that the Foundation's literature avoid using Marcus's name or photograph at all, telling Priya that the boy had already given enough to this story without becoming a permanent fixture in it. The first time Calloway came back to Bellwether Avenue after everything was settled, he did not arrive with cameras or assistants or anyone from his company at all. He came alone. In an ordinary car he rarely drove himself, and Renata met him at the door with the kind of cautious warmth that comes after trust has been tested and, against expectation, held. Marcus showed him the spiral notebook that afternoon, the one held together with tape along the spine, walking him page by page through diagrams he had copied from his father 6 years earlier, explaining each one in his father's exact cadence, patient and certain, like the world made sense if you paid close enough attention to it. The twist nobody saw coming was not the money, and it was not the headline. It was that Richard Calloway, a man who had spent 15 years building walls around his own life to keep people out, found himself, for months later, sitting at Marcus Webb's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, listening to the boy explain how to read the language of a building, in the voice of a father neither of them could bring back, but whose name, at least, the world now finally had right. Was justice really served? Or was it simply the closest thing to justice that money and influence could still manage to build years too late? Would you have noticed the warning Marcus saw that morning? Or would you, like almost everyone else on that street, have kept walking? And if a single 12-year-old's voice was loud enough to stop a billionaire's car, What does that tell us about the things we walk past every single day without ever stopping to listen? To understand what those 4 years of fighting had actually cost the Webb family, you have to understand what an appeal like Andre's actually looks like from the inside, not as a single dramatic court date, but as a slow, grinding war fought across a kitchen table covered in manila folders for months at a time. The first lawyer the family hired, a man named Gerald Okafor, who took the case largely out of personal conviction after reading the initial incident report, warned them honestly in their first meeting that cases like this rarely moved quickly, and that the company on the other side had resources the Webb family could never match. He was right on both counts. The first 8 months were spent simply forcing the company's legal department to release internal documents they were not eager to hand over, motion after motion, each one costing money the family did not have, each one delayed by procedural objections that seemed, to Renata, designed purely to exhaust them into giving up. Andre took on a job driving a delivery route within 3 weeks of his termination, not because he had given up on clearing his name, but because the mortgage on Bellwether Avenue did not pause for a legal proceeding. He left the apartment at 5 in the morning and returned most nights well after 8, his hands raw from the steering wheel and hand truck, a different kind of exhaustion than the one he'd carried as a foreman, duller, more grinding, without the quiet pride he used to feel walking a job site at the end of a long day. Marcus, 8 years old when the collapse happened, noticed the change before his mother ever sat him down to explain any of it. His father stopped bringing home blueprints. The Sunday lessons did not stop entirely, but they grew shorter, squeezed into 30 minutes before Andre fell asleep in his chair. The rolled-up drawings replaced more often by old receipts and grocery lists, the only paper within reach. Renata picked up extra shifts at St. Agnes Memorial whenever she could get them, trading her usual rotation for whatever overtime the floor supervisor would offer, coming home some mornings just as Andre was leaving for his route, the two of them passing each other in the hallway with a kiss and an update on legal fees instead of a real conversation. They sold the car first, a decision that meant Andre had to take 2 buses to reach the delivery company's depot every morning before his shift even started. They sold most of his tools next, the good ones, the ones he'd spent 2 decades collecting, keeping only the few he could not bear part with. They moved out of the Bellwether Avenue apartment 14 months into the appeal, into a smaller unit on the far side of the district, a move that added 40 minutes to Marcus's commute to the school his parents had specifically chosen for its strong after-school programs, a sacrifice neither parent ever framed to him as a sacrifice, though he understood, even as a child, exactly what it was. There were moments scattered across those 2 years that Renata still thought about long after everything was finally resolved. The afternoon Andre came home holding a single sheet of paper, an internal memo Gerald Okafor's investigator had finally managed to obtain through a court order, the memo that first referenced a digital signature timestamp inconsistency nobody had previously flagged. Andre had read it standing in the kitchen doorway, still in his delivery uniform, and had simply sat down on the floor, not at the table, the floor, because his legs would not hold him, and Renata had sat down next to him, without either of them saying anything for nearly 10 minutes. There was also the morning, 11 months before Andre's death, when the independent engineering review was finally completed, confirming in plain technical language exactly what Andre had warned about in writing 3 separate times before the wall came down. Gerald called that morning to deliver the news, and Andre, listening on speakerphone in the kitchen, said only, "I know," quietly, almost to himself, because some part of him had known the truth the entire time, and the confirmation, when it finally came, brought less relief than exhaustion. The exoneration, when it was formally entered into the state record 2 years and 4 months after the collapse, restored his professional license in name only. No contractor in the region would return his calls. He applied to 11 different firms in the months following his exoneration, using the official court documents as proof of his cleared name, and received 11 polite rejections, each one citing some version of the same concern, that his name still surfaced in old news searches, that clients might be uncomfortable, that the company simply wasn't hiring foremen with his particular history at the moment. He kept driving his delivery route for another 1.5 years, telling Marcus, on the evenings he had energy left to talk, that being right and being believed were two very different things, and that a man sometimes had to settle for the first one and let the second one go. He died on a Sunday morning, 11 months before Marcus stood on Fairmont Street, collapsing in the kitchen while reaching for the kettle. Renata found him there when she came home from her overnight shift. The cardiologist who reviewed his records afterward noted, gently, that years of sustained stress could place real, measurable strain on heart, though he was careful to say that no single cause could ever be proven with certainty. Marcus, 12 years old by then, kept the spiral notebook from that morning forward like something sacred, adding to it less often, but never willing to let it out of his sight. Walter Hensley was not, in his own understanding of himself, a villain. This is, perhaps, the most uncomfortable part of the story to tell honestly, because villains are easy to hate from a distance, and Walter Hensley, interviewed years later under oath, came across less as a monster than as an ordinary, frightened man who had made one catastrophic decision under pressure and then spent 4 years building an entire career on top of the lie rather than ever finding the courage to correct it. He had joined the company 14 years earlier as a junior project coordinator, working his way up through a culture that prized schedule adherence above almost everything else, a culture where missed deadlines were treated, in performance reviews and promotion decisions, as far more damaging than safety delays that never actually resulted in visible harm. By the time he was overseeing the retaining wall project, he had 2 young children at home, a mortgage of his own, and a divisional vice president breathing down his neck about a client who had explicitly tied a financial penalty clause to any delay past the agreed groundbreaking date. When Andre Webb's third warning landed on his desk 4 days before the scheduled groundbreaking, using the word emergency in the subject line, Hensley read it standing in his office at nearly 7 in the evening, alone, and made the decision that would define the rest of his life in the space of about 90 seconds. He told investigators, years later, that he had genuinely believed, in that moment, that the drainage issue Webb described was likely overstated, that form and flag concerns constantly, and most of them never amounted to anything, that the actual risk was probably low even if the paperwork said otherwise. This was, in the cold language of the later legal proceedings, a rationalization, not a defense, but it was the rationalization he told himself at 7 o'clock that evening as he logged into the inspection system, generated the final sign-off document, and typed Andre Webb's name into the signature field instead of walking the 200 yards to Webb's office and asking him to simply sign it himself. A conversation that would have taken less than 5 minutes and that Hensley, to his own later horror, simply could not bring himself to have, because some part of him already suspected what Webb would say. The wall came down 6 days later. 2 men died. Hensley spent the week following the collapse in a state he later described as something close to dissociation, going through the motions of the internal investigation, watching as the narrative settled, almost on its own, onto Andre Webb's shoulders. Because Webb's digital signature was on the final document and nobody at the time thought to question a record that fits so neatly with the version of events everyone already wanted to believe. Hensley did not actively construct the cover-up beyond that single forged signature. He simply let it stand. He told himself, in the months that followed, that correcting the record now would only compound the damage, would destroy his own career on top of the one already destroyed, would do nothing to bring back the 2 men who had died regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. Every justification was, in its own twisted way, almost reasonable in isolation, and that, more than anything, is what made the 4 years that followed so difficult for Calloway's investigators to fully untangle. Hensley was promoted 18 months after the collapse to Regional Operations Director, based on a performance record that, on paper, showed a man who had successfully managed a difficult crisis with minimal disruption to ongoing projects. He was promoted again 2 years after that to Divisional Vice President, a position that placed him only 2 levels below Calloway's own office. He attended the same leadership retreat where Calloway had once shaken his hand and complimented his numbers, standing in a conference room, making small talk about quarterly projections with a man whose company he had quietly, permanently damaged a family within, never once showing any outward sign of the weight he carried, because by then he later admitted he had become genuinely skilled at not thinking about it at all, compartmentalizing it into a part of his mind he simply did not visit. When investigators finally came for him, arriving at his office on an ordinary Wednesday morning with the forensic handwriting comparison, the badge logs, and the recovered email already in hand, Hensley did not deny it. He sat very still for a long moment, his children's school photographs visible on the credenza behind him. And then he said, quietly, "I've been waiting 4 years for someone to ask me about this." He was terminated that same afternoon. The criminal referral followed within weeks, charges of fraud and falsification of safety records that carried, given the deaths connected to the falsified inspection, the real possibility of prison time. At his eventual hearing, Renata Webb chose to attend, sitting in the gallery without speaking, and Hensley, during his own statement to the court, turned and addressed her directly, offering an apology that no legal advisor had told him to give, an apology Renata neither accepted nor rejected outright, telling reporters afterward only that some debts could not be settled with words, no matter how sincerely they were offered. The relationship that grew between Richard Calloway and the Webb family over the year following the public retraction did not unfold the way either of them might have expected, had either of them tried to predict it in advance. Calloway's first instinct, in the immediate aftermath of the settlement, was to manage his involvement the way he managed everything else, efficiently, through structured channels, periodic check-ins scheduled by Priya, formal updates on the Foundation's progress delivered in quarterly reports. It was Marcus, in the end, who quietly dismantled that structure, simply by being a 12-year-old boy who wanted to show an adult his notebook and ask him questions about logistics networks and freight schedules with the same patient curiosity his father had once shown him about load-bearing beams. The first few visits were stiff in the particular way that visits between very different kinds of people often are. Calloway arrived the first time in a suit, sat carefully on the edge of the Webb's second-hand couch, and answered Marcus's questions about his company with the same measured, slightly guarded tone he used in shareholder meetings. Renata, watching from the kitchen, later admitted she had braced herself for this to be a temporary arrangement, a billionaire's guilty conscience working itself out over a few visits before quietly fading into occasional checks and a standing trust fund administered by lawyers neither of them would ever speak to directly. She had seen wealthy guilt before, in smaller forms, throughout the years of Andre's case, and she did not entirely trust it to last. It was a Sunday in February, 4 months after the scaffold, when something genuinely shifted. Marcus had pulled out the spiral notebook unprompted, flipping to a diagram his father had drawn explaining how weight distributed unevenly across a poorly anchored support beam, and he began explaining it to Calloway the way his father had once explained it to him, slowly, patiently, tapping the page with his finger exactly the way Andre used to. Calloway, who had sat through hundreds of formal engineering briefings over the course of his career, found himself listening to a 12-year-old's explanation of structural load distribution with a kind of attention he rarely gave anyone, in part because the explanation was genuinely good, and in part because he understood, watching Marcus's face as he spoke, that he was witnessing a dead man's voice carried forward in his son's hands. He came back the following Sunday without being asked, and the Sunday after that. He stopped wearing suits to these visits within a few months, arriving instead in the kind of plain clothes he almost never wore in public, jeans and an unremarkable jacket, deliberately unremarkable, because he had come to understand that the formality of his usual presentation made Renata's small apartment feel smaller, made the visits feel like inspections rather than what they had slowly become. He brought Marcus, on one visit, an actual structural engineering textbook, college level, far beyond anything a 12-year-old should reasonably have been expected to read, and Marcus devoured it over the following months anyway, asking Calloway questions Calloway could not always answer himself, prompting him, more than once, to call on a senior engineer from his own company just to help answer a curious child's questions properly. Renata watched this unfold with a wariness that softened gradually, month by month, not because Calloway ever did anything dramatic to earn her trust, but because of the accumulation of small, ordinary things, remembering Marcus's school schedule without being told twice, asking after her own work at St. Agnes Memorial with what seemed like genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Showing up on a Sunday in June with a flat tire on his ordinary, unremarkable car, and simply laughing about it rather than being visibly irritated the way she half expected a man of his stature to be. She told Priya, nearly a year into the arrangement, that she had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, which was for a woman who had spent years bracing herself against disappointment from people connected to Andre's case, as close to an endorsement as she was capable of giving. By the time the first anniversary of the scaffold incident arrived, Calloway had become, in every meaningful sense except the legal one, something like an uncle to Marcus, a presence in the family's life that nobody, least of all Calloway himself, had planned for or fully understood. He told Priya once, in a rare, unguarded moment near the end of a long day, that he had spent 15 years building a life efficient enough to need almost nobody, and that somewhere in the space of a single year, a boy with a taped-together spiral notebook had quietly undone all of it, and that he did not particularly want it undone any other way. The criminal proceeding against Walter Hensley took place 14 months after the morning on Fairmont Street, in a courtroom that filled, on its second day, with reporters who had finally connected the dots between a quietly issued corporate retraction and a name that had once, for years earlier, dominated local headlines for entirely different reasons. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the forensic handwriting comparison, the badge access logs, and the recovered internal email, each piece individually persuasive, together nearly impossible to argue against. Hensley's defense attorney attempted, in his opening statement, to frame the falsified signature as a desperate but ultimately understandable response to corporate pressure that Hensley himself had not created, a structural failure of company culture rather than a single man's moral failure. The prosecution's response was simple and direct. Pressure explains a decision. It does not excuse the deliberate, sustained choice to let an innocent man's reputation absorb the consequences for 4 full years rather than correct the record at any point along the way. Renata Webb testified on the third day, walking the courtroom through the years that followed her husband's termination with a steadiness that surprised even her own legal counsel, describing the sold car, the sold tools, the 11 rejected job applications, the move to a smaller apartment, the particular quality of her husband's silence in the final months before his death. She did not raise her voice once during nearly 2 hours of testimony, and several jurors, according to court reporters present that day, were visibly moved by the careful, almost clinical precision with which she recounted details most people in her position might have delivered through tears. She wanted, she told a reporter afterward, for the jury to understand the cost of the lie in concrete terms, not abstract grief, because abstract grief was easy to sympathize with and easy to set aside, while sold tools and rejected job applications were harder to look away from. Marcus did not testify. Both Renata and the prosecution agreed early on that there was no need to put a 13-year-old boy through cross-examination in a case that did not require his direct account of events, though he attended several sessions from a gallery, sitting quietly beside his mother, watching Walter Hensley from a distance for the first time. He later told Calloway that Hensley looked smaller than he had imagined, not the looming villain of the story he had constructed in his head over the preceding months, just a tired, ordinary-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who would not meet anyone's eyes for most of the proceeding. Hensley was convicted on all counts after 11 days of testimony, the jury deliberating for just under 6 hours before returning a verdict. At sentencing, his attorney argued for leniency based on his lack of prior criminal history and the absence of any direct intent to cause the deaths that resulted from the collapse, since the forged signature had concerned only the inspection sign-off and not the underlying drainage flaw itself. The judge, in handing down a sentence that included several years of prison time alongside substantial fines, noted explicitly that the falsification had directly prevented a known safety concern from being properly addressed, and that the 4 years Hensley spent allowing an innocent man's name to bear the consequences represented, in the judge's words, a sustained choice repeated daily, not a single moment of panic, language that several legal commentators later cited as unusually pointed for a sentencing statement in a case of this kind. Outside the courthouse, following the verdict, reporters pressed Renata for a statement. She gave only one sentence, the same sentence she had repeated quietly to herself throughout the long months of the proceeding. My husband told the truth when it cost him everything, and it took 4 years and a 12-year-old boy standing in the street for anyone to finally believe him. She did not take further questions. Calloway, standing slightly apart from the cameras with Marcus beside him, said nothing to the press at all, a silence that several outlets noted as conspicuous for a man whose company's name had been central to the entire story, though those close to him understood it simply as Calloway keeping a promise he had made to Renata on the very first day in the hospital visiting room, that this would never become a story told for his own benefit. On the 1-year anniversary of the morning Marcus Webb stood in the middle of Fairmont Street waving his arms at a line of black SUVs. The scaffold itself was long gone, replaced by a finished building with a small brass plaque near its entrance. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it, dedicating the structural reinforcement standards used throughout its construction to the memory of a foreman named Andre Webb. Calloway had insisted on the plaque over the objections of his own communications team, who worried it invited exactly the kind of public attention he had spent the past year deliberately avoiding. He told them, simply, that some things were worth the attention, and that this was one of them. Marcus, 13 years old by then, taller, with his father's same habit of going quiet when he was thinking hard about something, still carried the taped-together spiral notebook, though it had been joined over the preceding year by 2 newer notebooks filled with more advanced diagrams, the product of patient evening tutoring sessions Calloway had arranged with one of his own senior structural engineers, a woman named Dr. Felicia Aronson, who had taken an immediate and genuine liking to a 13-year-old who asked better questions than most of the junior engineers she supervised. Renata still worked her shifts at St. Agnes Memorial, though fewer of them now. The financial pressure of the preceding years finally, fully lifted, and she had begun, in her limited free time, sitting in on Andre Webb Structural Integrity Fund board meetings with the same careful, unflinching attention she had once brought to 19 years of marriage to a man who read buildings like other people read books. Calloway still came on Sundays, less formally now, often staying for dinner, a fixture in the Webb family's life in a way neither he nor Renata nor Marcus could have predicted on the morning a scaffold groaned over a line of parked cars. He had changed, in ways his own board members noticed without entirely understanding why. Slower to dismiss a junior employee's safety concern in a meeting, quicker to ask whether a deadline pressure was worth the risk it carried. A man who had spent 15 years building walls around his own life, and had spent the past year, almost without meaning to, taking a few of them carefully down. Was justice really served? Or was it simply the closest thing to justice that money and influence could still manage to build years too late? Would you have noticed the warning Marcus saw that morning? Or would you, like almost everyone else on that street, have kept walking? And if a single 12-year-old's voice was loud enough to stop a billionaire's car, and loud enough, in the end, to bring a dead man's truth back into the light, what does that tell us about the things we walk past every single day without ever stopping to listen? If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to put together, tell us in the comments what part hit you hardest: the scaffold, the forged signature, Walter Hensley's quiet confession, or that final Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table a year later. And if you found yourself holding your breath during this one, wait until you hear the story we're bringing you next, because this will not be the last time a single act of courage changes the entire direction of someone's life. Subscribe for more real stories of ordinary people who refuse to look away, and we will see you in the next one.